This is the full audiobook of Richer, Wiser, Happier by William Green, presented by the Legendary Investor Channel.
Introduction. Inside the minds of the greatest investors. I've been obsessed with investing for a quarter of a century. At first it seemed an unlikely passion. I had never taken a class in business or economics. I had no talent for numbers and no grasp of the esoteric mysteries of accounting. After leaving Oxford with a degree in English literature, I reviewed novels for magazines and wrote profiles of fraudsters and murderers. As an aspiring author with high-minded dreams of literary fame, I found it easy to dismiss Wall Street as a casino full of crass speculators who cared only about money. When the New York Times landed on my doorstep, I would jettison the business section without even glancing at it. But in 1995, I found myself with a bit of cash to invest, my half of the proceeds from the sale of an apartment that I owned with my brother. I began to read incessantly about stocks and funds, eager to increase my modest windfall. This reawakened in me a gambling streak that had briefly run wild when I was a teenager in England in the 1980s. At 15, when I was a student at Eton, I'd sneak out of school on lazy summer afternoons and spend hours at a local turf accountant near Windsor Castle, betting on horses while my classmates played cricket or went rowing. I was meant to become a posh English gentleman like Boris Johnson, Prince William, and 6 centuries of Etonians before us. Instead, I had an illegal betting account under the name of Mike Smith. My interest in horse racing was fueled not by the romance of the sport or the majesty of the equine form, but by a desire to make money without working. I took it seriously, jotting down elaborate notes about horses and courses, using multicolored ink pens to highlight my wins and losses. I ruined my 16th birthday by fighting with my parents over their refusal to buy me a subscription to Timeform, a pricey system for rating horses. I was outraged that they blocked this obvious route to untold riches. Shortly afterward, following a string of disillusioning losses, I renounced racing once and for all. A decade later, when I began to read about investing, I discovered that the stock market offered similar thrills, but the odds of success were much higher. Stocks struck me as the perfect way to cash in merely by outthinking other people. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing, but I had one inestimable advantage. As a journalist, I could indulge my new fixation by interviewing many of the best investors in the business. In the years that followed, I interviewed a pantheon of investment legends for Forbes, Money, Fortune, and Time, returning again and again to the same overarching questions that fascinate me to this day. What principles, processes, insights, habits, and personality traits enable this tiny minority to beat the market in the long run and become spectacularly rich? More important, how can you and I profit by studying these financial outliers and reverse engineering their winning ways? Those questions lie at the heart of this book. To my delight, many of the investors I encountered were fascinating and oddly exotic. I flew to the Bahamas to spend a day with Sir John Templeton, the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century, who lived in a Caribbean idyll called Life at Key. I traveled to Houston for an audience with Fayez Seraphim, an enigmatic Egyptian billionaire nicknamed the Sphinx. In his office, he displayed paintings by El Greco and Willem de Kooning, along with a 5th century mosaic floor imported from a Syrian church. I spoke with Mark Mobius, the bald eagle, who flew around the developing world in a Gulfstream jet adorned with gold-plated fixtures and iguana skin upholstery, purchased from a Middle Eastern tycoon who had fallen on hard times. I interviewed Michael Price, a polo-playing centimillionaire who terrorized underperforming CEOs and came to be known as the scariest SOB on Wall Street. I met Helmut Friedlander, who had fled from Germany in the 1930s, stopping only to pick up his teenage sister and buy a hat, because a gentleman does not travel without a hat. He drank Chateau Petrus, collected precious medieval books, and traded everything from coffee futures to the Empire State Building. In his 90s, he told me, "I have lived uproariously." It was a priceless education. Jack Bogle, the index fund icon who founded Vanguard, which now manages $6.2 trillion, talked to me about the formative investment lessons he had learned from his mentor and hero, a mutual fund pioneer named Walter Morgan. Don't get carried away. Don't take excessive risk. Keep your costs low. And the crowd is always wrong. As we shall see, Bogle also explained why you don't need to be great to thrive as an investor. Peter Lynch, Fidelity's most famous fund manager, talked to me about how he had won by outworking everybody else. But he also spoke about the wild unpredictability of markets and the need for humility. You get a lot of A's and B's in school. In the stock market, you get a lot of F's. And if you're right 6 or 7 times out of 10, you're very good. Lynch recalled one of his first failures. A high-flying apparel business went bust, all because of the movie Bonnie and Clyde, which altered women's fashions so unexpectedly that the company's inventory became worthless. Ned Johnson, the multi-billionaire who built Fidelity into a behemoth, laughed and told Lynch, "You did everything right. Things come out of left field every now and then." In the tumultuous days after 9/11, when financial markets were suffering their worst week since the Great Depression, I headed to Baltimore to visit Bill Miller, who was in the midst of an unprecedented streak of beating the S&P 500 index for 15 years running. We spent a few days together and traveled in his Learjet, which he had bought in part so that his 110-pound Irish wolfhound could fly with him. The economy was reeling, war was brewing in Afghanistan, and his fund had tumbled 40% from its peak. But Miller was relaxed and cheerful, coolly staking hundreds of millions of dollars on beaten-down stocks that subsequently soared. One morning, I was standing beside him when he rang his office to check in. The analyst on the other end of the line broke it to him that AES, a stock that Miller had only just bought, had announced terrible earnings. The stock halved, costing him $50 million before lunchtime. Miller instantly doubled his bet, calmly assuming that irrational investors had overreacted to the company's dismal news. As he explained to me, investing is a constant process of calculating the odds. It's all probabilities. There is no certainty. And then there was Bill Ruane, one of the most successful stock pickers of his generation. When Warren Buffett closed his investment partnership in 1969, he recommended Ruane as a replacement for himself. Until his death in 2005, Ruane's Sequoia Fund generated stunning returns. He almost never granted interviews, but we spoke at length about the 4 guiding principles he had learned in the 1950s from a major star named Albert Hettinger. "Those simple rules have been of enormous importance to me," said Ruane. "They formed the basis for a large part of my philosophy ever since, and they are the best advice I can give people." First, warned Ruane, do not borrow money to buy stocks. He recalled an early experience when, by using leverage, he took $600 and multiplied it many times. Then, the market cracked, and he was hit so hard that he sold out and was back almost to square one. As he discovered then, you don't act rationally when you're investing borrowed money. Second, watch out for momentum. That's to say, proceed with extreme caution when you see markets going crazy, either because the herd is panicking or charging into stocks at irrational valuations. Third, ignore market predictions. I firmly believe that nobody knows what the market will do. The important thing is to find an attractive idea and invest in a company that's cheap. For Ruane, the 4th principle was the most important of all. Invest in a small number of stocks that you've researched so intensively that you have an informational advantage. I try to learn as much as I can about 7 or 8 good ideas, he said, If you really find something very cheap, why not put 15% of your money in it? For regular investors, there are safer paths to success. Most people would be much better off with an index fund, said Ruane. But for investors aiming to beat the market, concentration struck him as the smart way to go. I don't know anybody who can really do a good job investing in a lot of stocks, except Peter Lynch. When we spoke in 2001, Ruane told me that 35% of Sequoia's assets were riding on a single stock, Berkshire Hathaway. It had fallen out of favor during the dot-com craze, and Buffett, its chairman and CEO, was lambasted for losing his touch. Yet Ruane saw what others missed: a wonderful company with superior growth prospects run by the smartest guy in the country. What I began to understand is that the greatest investors are intellectual mavericks. They're not afraid to question and defy conventional wisdom. They profit from the misperceptions and mistakes of people who think less rationally, rigorously, and objectively. In fact, one of the best reasons to study the investors spotlighted in this book is that they can teach us not only how to become rich, but how to improve the way we think and reach decisions. The rewards for investing intelligently are so extravagant that the business attracts many brilliant minds. But there can also be a devastating price to pay for being wrong, which is rarely the case for professors, politicians, and pundits. The stakes involved may explain why the best investors tend to be open-minded pragmatists who search relentlessly for ways to improve their thinking. This mindset is embodied by Buffett's frighteningly clever partner, Charlie Munger, who once remarked, "I observe what works and what doesn't, and why." Munger, who is one of the central figures in this book, has roamed far and wide in his quest for better ways to think, borrowing analytical tools from disciplines as diverse as mathematics, biology, and behavioral psychology. His role models include Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, and a 19th century algebraist named Carl Gustav Jacobi. "I learned a lot from a lot of dead people," Munger told me. "I always realized that there were a lot of dead people I ought to get to know." I've come to think of the best investors as an idiosyncratic breed of practical philosophers. They aren't trying to solve those abstruse puzzles that mesmerize many real philosophers, such as, does this chair exist? Rather, they are seekers of what the economist John Maynard Keynes called worldly wisdom, which they deploy to attack more pressing problems, such as, how can I make smart decisions about the future if the future is unknowable? They look for advantages wherever they can find them. Economic history, neuroscience, literature, stoicism, Buddhism, sports, the science of habit formation, meditation, or anything else that can help. Their unconstrained willingness to explore what works makes them powerful role models to study in our own pursuit of success, not only in markets, but in every area of life. Another way to think about the most skillful investors is as consummate game players. It's no coincidence that many top-notch money managers play cards for pleasure and profit. Templeton used his poker winnings to help pay for college during the Depression. Buffett and Munger are passionate about bridge. Mario Gabelli, a billionaire fund mogul, told me how he earned money as a poor boy from the Bronx by playing cards between rounds as a caddy at a fancy golf club. "I was 11 or 12, he recalled, and everybody thought they could win." Lynch, who played poker in high school, college, and the army, told me, "Learning to play poker or learning to play bridge, anything that teaches you to play the probabilities, would be better than all the books on the stock market." As I've come to realize, it's helpful to view investing and life as games in which we must consciously and consistently seek to maximize our odds of success. The rules are elusive and the outcome uncertain, but there are smart ways to play and dumb ways to play. Damon Runyon, who was besotted with games of chance, once wrote that all life is 6 to 5 against. One of Runyon's greatest short stories is The Idyll of Miss Sarah Brown, which inspired the musical Guys and Dolls. The hero, a high-rolling gambler nicknamed The Sky, receives invaluable advice from his father about the perils of overconfidence, a warning that every investor would do well to internalize. "Son," the old guy says, "no matter how far you travel or how smart you get, always remember this. Someday, somewhere," he says, "a guy is going to come to you and show you a nice brand new deck of cards on which the seal is never broken, and this guy is going to offer to bet you that the Jack of Spades will jump out of this deck and squirt cider in your ear. But son," the old guy says, "do not bet him, for as sure as you do, you are going to get an earful of cider." Perhaps. But what captivates me is that Templeton, Bogle, Ruane, Buffett, Munger, Miller, and other giants whom we'll study in the chapters to come have figured out shrewd ways to stack the odds in their favor. My mission is to show you how. Consider Ed Thorpe, who is probably the greatest game player in investment history. Before he became a hedge fund manager, he achieved immortality in gambling circles by devising an ingenious scheme to beat the casino at blackjack. As Thorpe explained to me over a 3-hour breakfast of Eggs Benedict and cappuccino, he refused to accept the conventional belief that it was mathematically impossible for players to gain an edge over the dealer. Thorpe, the father of card counting, gave himself an advantage by calculating the change in probabilities once certain cards were gone from the deck and no longer available. For example, a deck packed with aces offered him better odds than one without them. When the odds favored him, he bet more. When they favored the casino, he bet less. Over time, his modest advantage became overwhelming. Thus, he transformed a loser's game of luck into a lucrative game of math. For his next trick, Thorpe figured out how to beat the casino at roulette. He and a partner, Claude Shannon, created the first wearable computer, which Thorpe activated furtively with a big toe inside his shoe. The computer, which was the size of a cigarette pack, enabled him to measure the position and velocity of the ball and rotor very accurately, so he could predict where the ball was likely to land. For centuries, roulette was a mug's game in which players had no edge since the ball has an equal chance of falling in each of 38 pockets. But by adding some knowledge and some measurement, we get a little better grasp on the probabilities of what's going to happen, said Thorpe. You won't get it right every time, but your forecast will be somewhat better than chance. So we were turning what seemed like a game of pure chance into a game where we had an edge, and the edge was provided by the information that we were adding. Unless you own a casino, Thorpe's subversive genius is irresistibly appealing. It was never the money that excited him so much as the joy of solving interesting problems that all of the experts insisted were insoluble. Just because a lot of people say something is true, that doesn't carry any particular weight with me, said Thorpe. You need to do some independent thinking, especially about the important things, and try to work them out for yourself. Check the evidence. Check the basis of conventional beliefs. As Thorpe's adventures suggest, one critical way to improve our financial lives is to avoid games in which the odds are stacked against us. As far as gambling is concerned, if I don't have an edge, I don't play, said Thorpe. Applying that same principle, the rest of us would be wise to face reality as honestly as possible. For example, if my knowledge of technology is flimsy, or I lack the basic financial skills required to value a business, I should resist any temptation to pick individual tech stocks for myself. Otherwise, I'm like the patsy at the roulette wheel, hoping that fate will smile kindly upon me despite my delusions. As Jeffrey Gundlach, a coldly rational billionaire who oversees about $140 billion in bonds, remarks to me, hope is not a method. Another common mistake that tilts the odds against many unsuspecting investors is to pay lavish fees to mediocre fund managers, stockbrokers, and financial advisors whose performance doesn't justify the expense. If you're paying tolls as you go and trading costs, advisory fees, all kinds of other charges, you're swimming against the current, said Thorpe. If you're not paying all these things, you're swimming with the current. One obvious way, then, for regular investors to boost their odds of long-term victory is to buy and hold index funds that charge minuscule fees. You don't have to do any work, and you're ahead of maybe 80% of the people who do otherwise. An index such as the S&P 500 will probably rise in the long run, added Thorpe, driven by the expansion of the American economy. So, unlike gamblers in a casino, you have an automatic edge by merely participating in the market's upward trajectory at a minimal cost. By contrast, Thorpe's hedge fund crushed the indexes over 2 decades without a single losing quarter by focusing on more obscure investment opportunities that were not well understood. For example, his exceptional math skills enabled him to value warrants, options, and convertible bonds with unrivaled accuracy. Other key characters in this book, such as Howard Marks and Joel Greenblatt, gained similar advantages by specializing in neglected or detested niches of the financial markets. As we shall see, there are many ways to win, but they all require some form of edge. When I asked Thorpe how to tell whether I have one, he offered this disconcerting thought. Unless you have a rational reason to believe you have an edge, then you probably don't. When my investment journey began 25 years ago, I yearned to be financially free and answerable to nobody. The best investors had cracked the code, which seemed almost magical to me. But what I realize now is that understanding how these individuals think and why they win can help us immeasurably in so many ways, financially, professionally, and personally. For example, when I asked Thorpe how to maximize my odds of a happy and successful life, he illustrated his characteristic approach by discussing health and fitness. Thorpe, who was 84 but looked 20 years younger, observed, "Genetically, you're dealt certain cards. You can think of that as chance. But you have choices about how to play those cards, including the choice to avoid cigarettes, have annual medical checkups, keep your vaccinations up to date, and exercise regularly." In his 30s, Thorpe was in terrible shape and found himself gasping for breath after jogging for a quarter of a mile. So he started running 1 mile every Saturday, improving gradually until he completed 21 marathons. He still sees a personal trainer twice a week and walks 3 miles a day 4 times a week. But when someone suggested that he take up biking, Thorpe scrutinized the number of deaths per 100 million passenger miles for cycling and decided that the risk was too high. When I spoke with him again, it was June 2020 and the world was gripped by a pandemic that had already killed more than 100,000 Americans. Thorpe explained how he had analyzed the mortality data from around the globe, paying particular attention to unexplained deaths that were probably caused by the virus, how he had drawn inferences from the 1918 flu pandemic that had killed his grandfather, how he had produced his own estimate of the true fatality rate, and how he had predicted in early February, before a single death was recorded in the United States, that the country would lose 200,000 to 500,000 lives to this new coronavirus over the next 12 months. Thorpe's methodical analysis of the data enabled his family to take timely precautions when few Americans, least of all the nation's leaders, recognized the magnitude of the threat. "We prudently put away supplies of all kinds, including masks," he said. It was about a month later that people woke up and started cleaning out store shelves. 3 weeks before the government declared a national emergency, Thorpe placed himself in isolation at his home in Laguna Beach and stopped seeing everybody except his wife. "There's no point being scared," he told me. But he understood the risks and acted decisively to augment his odds of survival. Thorpe may be the only person I've ever met who actually calculated his own chance of dying. How did Thorpe estimate the odds that COVID-19 would kill him? A random 87-year-old male has about a 20% chance of dying if he gets the virus. He told me, my risk is lower because a lot of 87-year-old males have significant other health problems, and I don't. I have no comorbidity. I'm also super careful, and I'm quite fit for my age. So I figured my chance of being killed by it is between 2 and 4%, but that's still plenty high. That mental habit of thinking dispassionately about facts and figures, probabilities, trade-offs between risk and reward, and the paramount importance of simply avoiding catastrophe does much to explain how the savviest investors live long and prosper. As Thorpe sees it, every aspect of our behavior should be guided by an attitude of generalized rationality. For example, he knows that he's more likely to make bad decisions when he's in emotional mode. So if he's irritated or mad at somebody, he takes a step back and asks himself, what do you really know? Is your feeling justified or not? His measured analysis often indicates to him that his adverse reaction was unwarranted. We jump to conclusions when we shouldn't, he observed, and so withholding judgment is, I think, a key element of rational behavior. All of this leads me to believe that the true titans of the investment world can help us to become richer, wiser, and happier. My goal is to show you how they win both in markets and life by finding countless ways to optimize the odds of success. Playing the odds is an extraordinarily effective way to operate, and it pervades everything they do, including how they manage their time, how they construct a calm environment in which to think, whom they hang out with and steer clear of, how they guard against biases and blind spots, how they learn from mistakes and avoid repeating them, how they handle stress and adversity, how they think about honesty and integrity, how they spend money and give it away, and how they attempt to build lives imbued with a meaning that transcends money. In writing this book, I have drawn deeply from the most important interviews I conducted in the distant past with many of the world's best investors. But I've also spent hundreds of hours interviewing more than 40 investors specifically for this book, reporting everywhere from Los Angeles to London, Omaha to Mumbai. Between them, the characters you will meet here have overseen trillions of dollars on behalf of millions of people. My hope is that these extraordinary investors will enlighten and enrich your life. I would bet on it. Chapter 1. The Man Who Cloned Warren Buffett. How to succeed by shamelessly borrowing other people's best ideas. A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme, so that if his ability does not equal theirs, at least it will savor of it. Niccolo Machiavelli. I believe in the discipline of mastering the best that other people have ever figured out. I don't believe in just sitting down and trying to dream it all up yourself. Nobody's that smart. Charlie Munger. It's 7 a.m. on Christmas Day. Monish Pabrai steps into a minivan in Mumbai as the sun rises in the smoggy sky. We drive for hours along the western coast of India toward a territory called Dadra and Nagar Haveli. Our driver intermittently executes terrifying maneuvers, swerving wildly between trucks and buses. I close my eyes and grimace in horror as horns blare on all sides. Pabrai, who grew up in India before moving to the United States for college, smiles serenely, always calm in the presence of risk. Still, he concedes, the accident rate in India is high. It's a riveting drive, full of mind-bending sights. At one point, we pass a plump man by the side of the road who's stacking bricks on top of a skinny woman's head so she can carry them. As we drive deeper into the countryside, we see squat huts covered with grass, structures that seem to belong to another millennium. Finally, we reach our destination, a rural high school called JNV Silvassa. Pabrai, one of the preeminent investors of his generation, has traveled here from his home in Irvine, California, to visit 40 teenage girls. They are part of a program run by his charitable foundation, Darkshana, which educates gifted children from disadvantaged families across India. Darkshana is providing these girls with 2 years of free schooling to prepare them for the infamously difficult entrance exam to the Indian Institutes of Technology, IIT, a group of elite engineering colleges whose graduates are coveted by companies such as Microsoft and Google. More than 1 million students apply to IIT each year, and less than 2% are accepted. But Darkshana has cracked the code. Over 12 years, 2,146 Darkshana scholars have won places at IIT, an acceptance rate of 62%. Pabrai views Darkshana, a Sanskrit word meaning gift, as a means of uplifting the most underprivileged segments of Indian society. Most Darkshana scholars come from rural families that survive on less than $2 a day. Many belong to lower castes, including untouchables who have suffered centuries of discrimination. Whenever Pabrai visits a Darkshana classroom, he breaks the ice by posing the same mathematical problem. Everyone who has solved it has subsequently won a place at IIT, so it's a useful way to gauge the talent in the room. The question is so hard that almost nobody gets it right, and he expects none of the Silvassa students to meet the challenge. Nonetheless, he writes the problem in chalk on the blackboard at the front of the classroom. N is a prime number greater than or equal to 5. Prove that n squared minus 1 is always divisible by 24. Then he leans back in a flimsy plastic chair while the girls attempt to divine the answer. What's the answer to Pabrai's question? This is a mystery that will forever elude me. I wonder what they make of this flamboyant, larger-than-life creature. A tall, burly, balding money man with a luxuriant mustache who's dressed in a Darkshana sweatshirt and pink jeans. After 10 minutes, Pabrai asks, "Is anyone close?" A 15-year-old girl named Alyssa says, "Sir, it's only a theory." Her tentativeness instills no confidence, but Pabrai invites her to the front of the classroom to show him her solution. She hands him a sheet of white paper and stands meekly before him, head bowed, awaiting judgment. Above her, a sign on the wall says, in charmingly garbled English, "So long as you have faith in you, nothing will be able to abstract you." "It's correct," says Pabrai. He shakes Alyssa's hand and asks her to explain her answer to the class. He later tells me that she solved the problem so elegantly that she could rank in the top 200 in the IIT exam. Pabrai tells her that she's a sure shot to get in. All you have to do is keep working hard. I subsequently learn that Alyssa is from the Ganjam district in the state of Odisha, one of India's poorest districts, and was born into a caste that the government calls other backward classes. In her previous school, she ranked first out of 80 students. Pabrai asks Alyssa to pose for a photograph with him. "You will forget about me," he jokes, "but then I can tell you, we have the picture." The girls laugh delightedly, but I find it hard not to cry. We have witnessed something magical. A child plucked from poverty has just proven that she has the mental firepower to propel herself and her family into prosperity. Given the environment in which she was raised and the odds against her, it's a kind of miracle. Later that morning, the students pepper Pabrai with questions. Finally, one plucks up the courage to ask what everyone must want to know. "Sir, how did you make so much money?" Pabrai laughs and says, "I compound money." Searching for a way to illustrate the concept, he says, "I have a hero. His name is Warren Buffett. Who here has heard of Warren Buffett?" Not a single hand goes up. The room is a sea of blank faces. So he tells the students about his 18-year-old daughter, Momachi, and how she earned $4,800 in a summer job after high school. Pabrai invested that money for her in a retirement account. He asks the students to calculate what would happen if this modest nest egg was to grow by 15% a year for the next 60 years. It's doubling every 5 years. That's 12 doubles, he says. Life is all about doubles. A minute later, the students have figured it out. In 6 decades, when Momachi is 78 years old, her $4,800 will be worth more than $21 million. There is an air of wonder in the room at the awesome power of this mathematical phenomenon. "Are you going to forget about compounding?" asks Pabrai, and 40 impoverished teenagers from rural India cry out in unison, "No, sir." How to turn $1 million into $1 billion. Not so long ago, Monish Pabrai hadn't heard of Warren Buffett either. Raised in modest circumstances in India, he knew nothing about investing, Wall Street, or high finance. Born in 1964, he spent the first 10 years of his life in Bombay, now Mumbai, where his parents rented a tiny suburban apartment for $20 a month. They later moved to New Delhi and Dubai. The family was full of colorful characters. Pabrai's grandfather was a famous magician, Gojia Pasha, who toured the world posing as a mysterious Egyptian. As a boy, Pabrai appeared with him on stage. His role was to hold an egg. Pabrai's father, Om Pabrai, was an entrepreneur with an uncanny knack for founding companies that went bankrupt. Among his many ventures, he owned a jewelry factory, launched a radio station, and sold magic kits by mail. Like his son, he was an incorrigible optimist, but his businesses were fatally undercapitalized and over-leveraged. "I watched my parents losing everything multiple times," says Pabrai. "And when I say losing everything, I mean not having enough money to buy groceries tomorrow, not having money to pay the rent. I never want to go through that again. But what I saw is that it didn't bother them. In fact, the biggest lesson I learned from them is that I didn't see them get rattled by it. My father used to say, 'You could put me naked on a rock, and I will start a new business.'" As a child, Pabrai performed poorly at school, once placing 62nd in a class of 65, and he suffered from low self-esteem. Then, in 9th grade, he was given an IQ test that changed his life. I went to the guy who administered the test and said, "What does the result mean?" He said, "Your IQ is at least 180. You're just not applying yourself." It was like someone whipping a horse and it starts. That was a big turning point. People have to be told they have something in them. After high school, he headed to Clemson University in South Carolina. There, he discovered the stock market. He took an investing class and averaged 106% going into the final. The professor tried to convince him to switch his major from computer engineering to finance. "I completely ignored his advice," says Pabrai. "My perspective at that time was that all these fuckers in finance are dumbasses. They don't know shit. And this super easy class I'm taking in investing is 1/10 as hard as my engineering mechanics class. So why would I want to go into a field with these losers?" After college, Pabrai took a job at Tel Labs. Then in 1990, he launched a technology consulting company, TransTech, bankrolling it with $70,000 in credit card debt and $30,000 from his 401k. Most people couldn't stomach that level of risk, but he's always had a gambling streak. Indeed, we once spent an entire flight discussing his adventures at the blackjack tables in Las Vegas, where he doggedly applies an extremely boring system developed by a card counter with a PhD in finance. Pabrai's game plan is to make $1 million and get banned from the casinos. By 2020, he had turned $3,000 into $150,000 and been banned for life by one small, seedy casino. TransTech thrived, ultimately employing 160 people, and Pabrai set aside $1 million in savings by 1994. For the first time, he had a war chest to invest. That year, he bought One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch while killing time in Heathrow Airport. It was there that he first read about Buffett. he was astonished to learn that Berkshire Hathaway's chairman and CEO had racked up investment returns of 31% annually over 44 years, starting at the age of 20. Thanks to the magic of compounding, this meant that an investment of $1 in 1950 would have grown to $144,523 by 1994. Pabrai reached a logical conclusion. Buffett was not a dumbass. As a boy, Pabrai had heard a tale about an Indian who supposedly invented chess. He presented his game to the king, who offered him a reward. The game inventor requested 1 grain of rice for the first square of his chessboard, 2 grains for the second square, 4 for the third, and so on, all the way to the 64th square. The king, who was arithmetically challenged, granted the request. Pabrai, who is not arithmetically challenged, says the king owed 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,615 grains of rice, now worth around $300 trillion. Remembering this story, Pabrai grasped instantly that Buffett had mastered the game of compounding. In 44 years, he had doubled his money 18 times and was already well on his way to becoming the richest man on earth. This set Pabrai thinking. What if he could figure out how Buffett picked stocks and could mimic his winning approach? Thus began what Pabrai describes as a 30-year game to turn his $1 million into $1 billion. The driver for me is not to get wealthy, he says. The driver is to win the game. It's exactly the same driver for Warren, which is to show through the results that I did the best, and I am the best, because I played the game by the rules, fair and square, and I won. Pabrai's approach to the challenge of becoming a billionaire holds important lessons for us all, not just as investors, but in every area of life. He didn't attempt to reinvent the wheel by, say, devising a new algorithm to exploit subtle pricing anomalies in the markets. Instead, he identified the most skillful player of this particular game, analyzed why he was so successful, then copied his approach with scrupulous attention to detail. Pabrai's term for this process is cloning. We could also call it modeling, mimicry, or replication, but the terminology doesn't matter. This is a technique for people who care more about winning than sounding respectable or highbrow. By cloning Buffett, and later his polymathic partner Charlie Munger, Pabrai has become one of the leading investors of our time. From 2000 to 2018, his flagship hedge fund returned a staggering 1,204% versus 159% for the S&P 500 index. If you had invested $100,000 with him when he started managing money in July 1999, it would have grown to $1,826,500 after fees and expenses by March 31st, 2018. This assumes you invested in his original partnership, Pabrai Investment Fund 1, at its inception in 1999 and held it till March 31st, 2018. Pabrai gave his initial investors a guarantee that he'd make them whole if they lost money. Realizing that this was onerously generous, he closed the fund and merged it with Pabrai Investment Fund 2 in 2002. It's worth noting that his returns have been wildly volatile. For example, he suffered a 15.1% loss in the first half of 2020, leaving his fund up 671.3% since inception, versus 218.4% for the S&P 500. One of his advantages is that these gut-wrenching swings don't bother him. Yet Pabrai's success, both as an investor and a philanthropist, is built entirely on smart ideas that he has borrowed from others. I'm a shameless copycat, he says. Everything in my life is cloned. I have no original ideas. Consciously, systematically, and with irrepressible delight, he has mined the minds of Buffett, Munger, and others, not only for investment wisdom, but for insights on how to manage his business, avoid mistakes, build his brand, give away money, approach relationships, structure his time, and construct a happy life. Pabrai's commitment to cloning raises an array of provocative questions. Is originality overrated? Instead of struggling to innovate, should most of us focus our energy on replicating what smarter and wiser people have already figured out? If cloning is such a powerful strategy for success, why don't more people use it? Are there dangers to cloning? And how can we benefit from it while also being true to ourselves? Over the last 7 years, I've spent a great deal of time with Pabrai. I've joined him on multiple trips to Omaha for Berkshire's annual meeting. I've interviewed him at his office in California. We've traveled together for 5 days in India, even sharing a bunk bed on an all-night train ride from Kota to Mumbai. And we've overeaten together everywhere, from his local Korean barbecue restaurant to a roadside shack in Jaipur. Along the way, I've come to appreciate the tremendous power of his method of reverse engineering, replicating, and often improving on other people's successful strategies. Pabrai, the most relentless cloner I've ever encountered, has taken the art of appropriation to such an extreme that, paradoxically, it seems oddly original. His thinking has had a profound impact on me. In fact, the overarching purpose of this book is to share what I would call ideas worth cloning. The laws of investing. When Pabrai discovers a subject that fascinates him, he attacks it with obsessive fervor. In Buffett's case, the available resources seemed limitless, including decades of letters to Berkshire's shareholders and seminal books such as Roger Lowenstein's Buffett, The Making of an American Capitalist. Pabrai devoured it all. He also began to make a pilgrimage each year to Omaha for Berkshire's annual meeting, showing up without fail for more than 20 years. Eventually, Pabrai would develop a personal relationship with Buffett. Through Buffett, he had also become friends with Munger, who invites him for meals at his home in Los Angeles and games of bridge at his club. But in those early days, Pabrai's knowledge came entirely from reading, and the more he read, the more convinced he became that Buffett, with Munger's help, had laid out the laws of investing, which are as fundamental as the laws of physics. Buffett's style of investing seemed so simple and so powerful that Pabrai considered it the only way to invest. But when he studied other money managers, he was perplexed to find that almost none lived by Buffett's laws. It was like meeting an entire set of physicists who don't believe in gravity. Whether you believe in gravity or not, it's fucking gonna pull you down. It was clear to Pabrai that most fund managers owned too many stocks, paid too much for them, and traded them too often. These mutual funds are sitting there with 1,000 positions or 200 positions. How can you find 200 companies that will all double? Then I look at what they own, and they own these things that are trading at 30 times earnings. I saw that they were all hosed. Pabrai had read a book by the management guru Tom Peters that told a cautionary tale of 2 self-service gas stations on opposite sides of the street. One prospers by providing high-quality service, such as cleaning windshields for free. The other does the bare minimum. What happens? Its customers inevitably drift to the better gas station. This error amazed Pabrai, since nothing could have been easier than simply to copy the superior strategy sitting in plain view. Humans have something weird in their DNA which prohibits them from adopting good ideas easily, says Pabrai. What I learned a long time back is keep observing the world inside and outside your industry, and when you see someone doing something smart, force yourself to adopt it. This sounds so obvious, even trite, but this one habit has played a decisive role in his success. So with the zeal of a true disciple, Pabrai committed to invest the way Warren said I should. Given that Buffett had averaged 31% a year, Pabrai naively assumed that it shouldn't be hard to average 26%. At that rate, His $1 million would double every 3 years and hit $1 billion in 30 years. As a reminder of this compounding target, his license plate reads COMLB26. Even if he missed by a mile, he expected to do fine. If, say, he averaged 16% a year, his $1 million would turn into $85.85 million in 30 years. Such is the glory of compounding. Of course, he had no MBA from a fancy school such as Wharton or Columbia, no qualification as a certified financial analyst, no experience on Wall Street. But Pabrai, who regards his entire life as a game, expected his rigorous application of Buffett's methodology to give him an edge over all of the fools who failed to follow the sage of Omaha. "I want to play games that I know I can win," says Pabrai. "So how do you win the game? You've got to play according to the rules. And the good news is, I'm playing against players who don't even fucking know the rules." As Pabrai saw it, Buffett's approach to stock picking grew out of 3 core concepts that he had learned from Benjamin Graham, the patron saint of value investing, who taught Buffett at Columbia and later hired him. First, whenever you buy a stock, you're purchasing a portion of an ongoing business with an underlying value, not just a piece of paper for speculators to trade. Second, Graham viewed the market as a voting machine, not a weighing machine, which means that stock prices frequently fail to reflect the true value of these businesses. As Graham wrote in The Intelligent Investor, it's useful to think of the market as a manic depressive who often lets his enthusiasm or his fears run away with him. Published in 1949, The Intelligent Investor has been hailed by Buffett as by far the best book on investing ever written. We'll meet its remarkable author at greater length in Chapter 4. Third, you should buy a stock only when it's selling for much less than your conservative estimate of its worth. The gap between a company's intrinsic value and its stock price provides what Graham called a margin of safety. But what does all of this mean in practical terms? Graham's insight that Mr. Market is prone to irrational mood swings has profound implications. For master investors such as Buffett and Munger, the essence of the game is to detach themselves from the madness and watch dispassionately until the bipolar market provides them with what Munger calls a mispriced gamble. There are no prizes for frenetic activity. Rather, investing is mostly a matter of waiting for these rare moments when the odds of making money vastly outweigh the odds of losing it. As Buffett has said, you don't have to swing at everything. You can wait for your pitch. The problem when you're a money manager is that your fans keep yelling, "Swing, you bum!" Sublimely indifferent to the cries of the crowd, Buffett can twiddle his thumbs for years. For example, he bought almost nothing from 1970 to 1972, when euphoric investors drove stocks to crazy valuations. Then, when the market crashed in 1973, he bought a major stake in the Washington Post Company, which he held for 4 decades. In his classic article, The Super Investors of Graham and Doddsville, Buffett wrote that the market valued the company at $80 million when you could have sold the assets to any one of 10 buyers for not less than $400 million. You don't try and buy businesses worth $83 million for $80 million. You leave yourself an enormous margin. When you build a bridge, you insist it can carry 30,000 pounds, but you only drive 10,000-pound trucks across it. And that same principle works in investing. In our hyperactive world, few people recognize the superiority of this slow and discerning strategy, which requires infrequent but decisive bursts of activity. Munger, a nonagerian whom Pabrai considers the brightest human he's ever met, embodies this approach. Munger once observed, "You have to be like a man standing with a spear next to a stream. Most of the time, he's doing nothing. When a fat, juicy salmon swims by, the man spears it. Then he goes back to doing nothing. It may be 6 months before the next salmon goes by." Few money managers function this way. Instead, says Pabrai, they place many bets, small bets, and frequent bets. The trouble is, there aren't enough compelling opportunities to justify all of this activity. So, Pabrai, like his two idols, prefers to wait for the most succulent salmon. During a conversation in his office in Irvine, he says, "The number one skill in investing is patience. Extreme patience." When the market crashed in 2008, he made 10 investments in 2 months. In more typical times, he bought just 2 stocks in 2011, 3 in 2012, and none in 2013. In 2018, Pabrai's offshore hedge fund owned no US stocks at all because nothing seemed cheap enough. Just think about that for a moment. Out of roughly 3,700 companies listed on the major US exchanges, Pabrai couldn't find a single irresistible bargain. Instead of settling for American stocks that seemed richly valued, he took his fishing spear to better stocked waters in India, China, and South Korea. As Munger likes to say, there are 2 rules of fishing. Rule number 1, fish where the fish are. Rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. Then, in the spring of 2020, the US market crashed as the COVID-19 virus spread terror among investors. The retail industry was ravaged, with stores forced to close indefinitely and consumers required to stay home in lockdown mode. One company at the epicenter of uncertainty was Seritage Growth Properties, whose tenants included many retailers that could no longer afford to pay their rent. "The market hates all of this near-term noise and pain," says Pabrai. He exploited the panic to buy a 13% stake in Seritage at exceptional prices, figuring that he'll ultimately make 10 times his money as fears recede and others recognize the value of its prime assets. Pabrai also liked that Buffett, whose investment record in real estate is almost perfect, owned Seritage in his personal stock portfolio. "Not only are we cloning his approach," Pabrai tells me, "we're directly cloning his position at 1/5 or 1/6 of the price he paid." Disclosure: cloning the cloner, I also invested in Seritage during the depths of the COVID crisis. Buffett, Munger, and Pabrai are not alone in pursuing this strategy of extreme patience and extreme selectivity. Their elite cohort includes great investors such as Francis Chu, one of Canada's most prominent fund managers. When I first interviewed him in 2014, Chu had 30% of his assets in cash and hadn't made a significant stock purchase in years. "When there's hardly anything to buy, you have to be very careful," he told me. "You cannot force the issue. You just have to be patient, and the bargains will come to you." He warned, if you want to participate in the market all the time, then it's a mug's game, and you're going to lose. How long can he go without buying? "Oh, I can wait 10 years, even longer," Chu replied. In the meantime, he studies stocks that aren't cheap enough to buy, hits balls at a golf range, and reads 200 to 400 pages a day. One technique that he uses to distance himself emotionally from the day-to-day drama of the market is to think of himself in the third person instead of the first person. Like Chu, Pabrai has constructed a lifestyle that supports this heroically inactive investment strategy. When I visited his office in Irvine, he was dressed in shorts, sneakers, and a short-sleeved shirt. He looked less like an adrenaline-fueled stock jockey than a vacationer contemplating a lazy stroll on the beach. Cloning Buffett, who once showed him the blank pages of his little black diary, Pabrai keeps his calendar virtually empty so he can spend most of his time reading and studying companies. On a typical day at the office, he schedules a grand total of 0 meetings and 0 phone calls. One of his favorite quotes is from the philosopher Blaise Pascal. "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quiet in a room alone." One challenge, says Pabrai, is that large motors aren't good at grinding away without resulting actions. He thinks Berkshire Hathaway's shareholders have profited immensely from Buffett's passion for playing online bridge, since this mental distraction counteracts the natural bias for action. Pabrai plays online bridge too, and he burns off energy by biking and playing racquetball. When there's nothing to buy and no reason to sell, he can also direct more attention to his charitable foundation. He says it helps that his investment staff consists of a single person, him. The moment you have people on your team, they're going to want to act and